Hey guys, tonight we're going to gently drift back in time to the smoky, gaslit streets of Victorian London, a bustling, ever-expanding metropolis where, surprisingly, a good night's sleep was becoming an increasingly elusive luxury. You might find yourself sympathizing with their plight, though you probably wouldn't survive a single night under their cures. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a cobbled street, the perpetually damp air clinging to your coat, as the gas lamps flicker into life, casting long, dancing shadows. The rhythmic clatter of hansom cabs echoes down the thoroughfare, punctuated by the distant cries of street vendors and the murmur of countless conversations. It's the mid-19th century, and London, like many industrializing cities, is a place of unprecedented change and relentless energy. The old rhythms of life, dictated by the sun's rise and fall, are slowly but surely being eroded. Factories hum through the night, their chimneys belching smoke into the perpetual twilight. Offices glow late, illuminated by the revolutionary, albeit sometimes headache-inducing, gaslight. This new, brightly lit world, a stark contrast to the sleepy, candlelit nights of previous centuries, inadvertently birthed a widespread affliction, insomnia. Imagine for a moment, living in a world where the working day could stretch interminably, where the city never truly slept, and where the relentless march of progress seemed to demand constant alertness. You're part of this new urban tapestry, perhaps a clerk poring over ledgers long after dark, or a lady of leisure whose social calendar demands endless engagements. The very fabric of society is being rewoven, and with it, the quiet stillness of night is being replaced by a persistent thrum. It's not just the external noise, though that certainly plays its part, it's also the internal hum, the overstimulated mind struggling to switch off in an era that, for the first time, truly made it difficult to do so. The Victorians, with their rigid social structures and burgeoning scientific curiosity, were suddenly faced with a problem that felt uniquely modern, a collective inability to simply rest. This wasn't merely a minor inconvenience, sleeplessness, or a nervous debility as it was often termed, began to be perceived as a serious threat to productivity, morality, and even sanity. A mainstream historical fact of the era is the sheer volume of discourse around nerves and neurasthenia, a catch-all term for various nervous disorders, of which insomnia was a prominent symptom. Doctors, philosophers, and even novelists grappled with this epidemic of wakefulness, trying to understand its roots and, more importantly, its remedies. You might pick up a popular magazine of the day and find articles earnestly debating the causes of brain fag and offering myriad suggestions for its alleviation. It became a topic of drawing room conversation, a lament shared among friends, and a constant worry for those who felt their minds racing long after their bodies craved slumber. The peculiar thing is, while we now understand the complex biological processes behind sleep, the Victorians were very much in the dark, groping for answers in an age of nascent medical understanding. It's a matter of debate if their insomnia was truly more prevalent than in previous eras, or if it was simply more talked about and diagnosed as the stresses of industrial life became undeniable. Perhaps it was always there, a quiet, personal struggle, but the Victorian era, with its penchant for cataloguing and categorizing every ailment, brought it squarely into the public consciousness. You might feel a pang of sympathy for them, trying to conquer something so fundamental without the benefit of modern science or even a comfortable mattress by today's standards. Consider the atmosphere of a typical Victorian bedroom. You might imagine a heavy, ornate bedstead, perhaps a vast canopy overhead, and thick velvet curtains blocking out the gaslight glow from the street. But comfort, as we know it, was a relative term. Mattresses were often stuffed with horsehair or straw, hardly conducive to a peaceful night. The very air could be thick with coal smoke, and the distant rumble of carriages on cobblestones would be a constant lullaby or a constant torment. It's easy to see how a sensitive constitution, already stressed by the demands of the day, would find such an environment anything but restful. Beyond the physical environment, there was also a profound psychological shift. The Victorian mind was often characterized by its earnestness, its moral rectitude, and a sometimes overwhelming sense of duty. You were expected to work hard, to strive for improvement, and to maintain a certain decorum. This relentless pressure, both external and internal, created a fertile ground for anxiety, and anxiety, as you well know, is sleep's most persistent enemy. Imagine yourself trying to drift off to sleep, your mind still replaying the day's events, worrying about your social standing, or perhaps even wrestling with profound theological questions that were so prevalent in the era. It's enough to keep anyone wide awake. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit from this era is the surprisingly widespread belief in the power of dreams as omens or messages from the subconscious. While not a cure for insomnia, this fascination with the dream world highlights the Victorians' deep engagement with the nocturnal experience, even as they struggled to attain it. Almanacs and popular periodicals often contain dream dictionaries, allowing you to decipher the hidden meanings of your nighttime visions, if you were lucky enough to have any. It's almost as if, even in their wakefulness, they were reaching out to the elusive world of sleep, seeking meaning in its absence. The paradox of the era is striking. On one hand, incredible advancements in technology and industry, pushing society forward at an unprecedented pace. On the other, a fundamental human need, sleep, being increasingly compromised. You see this tension reflected everywhere, from the architecture of the sprawling cities to the very language people use to describe their daily struggles. That peculiar case of Victorian insomnia cures, then, is not just about the bizarre remedies they concocted, but about the unique set of societal pressures that made sleep such a precious, and often unattainable, commodity for so many. It sets the stage for the fascinating, and sometimes alarming, attempts they made to reclaim their rest. As you continue your stroll through the gaslit streets, the pervasive sense of a society grappling with unseen forces becomes almost palpable. The problem of sleeplessness, which we just touched upon, wasn't merely a personal discomfort, it was quickly becoming a medical enigma. To truly understand the Victorian approach to silencing the racing mind, you first need to grasp the curious landscape of medicine during that era. It was a time of immense transition, a fascinating blend of ancient beliefs, burgeoning scientific discovery, and more than a little bit of outright quackery. You're entering a world where the germ theory of disease was still a radical concept, where anatomy was slowly being understood, but where the intricacies of the human brain remained largely uncharted territory. Imagine yourself stepping into a Victorian doctor's surgery. It's likely a dimly lit room, perhaps smelling faintly of carbolic acid or a concoction of herbs. The doctor, probably a stern-looking gentleman with a formidable set of whiskers, might offer you a diagnosis based as much on your perceived moral character as on any physical symptoms. The understanding of the human body was, by our standards, rudimentary. They knew about the major organs, certainly, but the complex interplay of systems, particularly the nervous system, was only just beginning to be explored. This nascent understanding meant that when it came to something as ephemeral as sleep, or the lack thereof, explanations often veered into the speculative, even the philosophical. A mainstream historical fact is the prevailing theory of humorism, which, though dating back to ancient Greece, still held considerable sway in various forms. This theory proposed that the body was made up of four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and an imbalance in these humors could lead to illness. While the most direct applications of humorism were fading, its underlying principle of internal balance, or rather imbalance, permeated medical thought. So, when you complained of a restless night, a Victorian physician might genuinely consider your diet, your temperament, and even the quality of your blood as potential culprits. It's a matter of debate if the gradual decline of humorism directly led to the rise of new, more empirical, but still often misguided, treatments, or if it simply opened a void that needed filling. You might find yourself wondering how many prescriptions were based on a genuine attempt at scientific rigor versus a physician's best guess or even a deeply ingrained societal prejudice. The concept of nerves themselves was a relatively new focal point. Previously, illnesses were often tied to specific organs or generalized weaknesses. But as society became more industrialized and people reported new forms of stress, the nervous system emerged as a convenient scapegoat for a myriad of complaints, including, most prominently, sleeplessness. Physicians would talk of overwrought nerves or nervous exhaustion, framing insomnia not as a standalone issue, but as a symptom of a deeper, systemic depletion of vital nervous energy. This concept, while vague, allowed them to connect the external pressures of modern life, the incessant noise, the demanding work schedules, the social anxieties, to the internal state of the individual. You were, in a sense, being drained of your very life force by the relentless pace of the age. This era also saw the slow, painstaking birth of specialized medical fields. Psychiatry, as we know it, was still very much in its infancy, often conflated with neurology. Doctors specializing in nervous disorders were emerging, but their understanding of the brain's chemical or electrical functions was almost non-existent. They operated on observable symptoms and often vague theories. For instance, a quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the belief among some medical professionals that excessive reading, especially by women, could lead to nervous debility and, by extension, insomnia. The mind, they reasoned, needed rest, and intellectual exertion, particularly in the quiet hours, could prevent it from finding peace. You might smile at the quaintness of this idea, but it reflects a deeper anxiety about social change and the perceived fragility of the human constitution in the face of modern stimuli. Against this backdrop of evolving, often uncertain, medical knowledge, the desperate search for sleep intensified. Patients, exhausted and increasingly desperate, would flock to doctors, eager for any remedy that might offer respite. And doctors, equally eager to provide solutions, often resorted to what they knew, what they had been taught, or what simply seemed to make logical sense within their limited framework. This meant a bewildering array of treatments, from the benign to the bizarre, from the genuinely helpful to the dangerously misguided. You can almost feel the collective sigh of frustration from those who tossed and turned night after night, as each new proposed cure offered fleeting hope before inevitably failing. The stage was set for an era of peculiar experiments in the pursuit of slumber, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle with the most fundamental of biological needs. With the stage set, depicting a society increasingly troubled by its racing minds, you might wonder, what did they turn to first? Well, in an age where scientific rigor was still finding its footing, and regulation was practically non-existent, the answer often lay in the colorful, persuasive, and frequently misleading world of patent medicines. You see them advertised everywhere in Victorian London, in newspapers, on handbills, splashed across the sides of omnibuses. These weren't prescriptions from a licensed doctor, they were proprietary concoctions sold directly to the public, promising miraculous cures for everything from a nagging cough to, you guessed it, stubborn sleeplessness. Imagine yourself flipping through a popular magazine, perhaps Punch or the Illustrated London News. Nestled between articles on political cartoons and grand imperial expeditions, you'd encounter flamboyant advertisements for Dr. So-and-so's grand elixir for nervous debility or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. These advertisements were masters of early marketing, playing on the anxieties of the age. They promised not just sleep, but a restoration of vital energy, a calm mind, and a return to productivity. The language was often hyperbolic, the testimonials glowing, and the claims utterly unsubstantiated. A mainstream historical fact about these patent medicines is their sheer ubiquity and the enormous fortunes built upon them. Companies like Beecham's and Holloway's became household names, their products sold across the globe, reaching even the most remote corners of the British Empire. You could walk into almost any chemist's shop, or even a general store, and pick up a bottle without a second thought. The allure was simple: self-medication, convenience, and the hope of a quick fix for a pervasive problem. For someone tossing and turning night after night, the promise of a miraculous draught could be incredibly tempting. The true marvel, or perhaps the true horror, of these elixirs lay in their ingredients. This is where things get truly peculiar. While many contained relatively harmless, if ineffective, components like herbs or alcohol, which, of course, might induce drowsiness temporarily, others contained far more potent, and often dangerous, substances. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the surprisingly common inclusion of cannabis in some Victorian sleep remedies. Yes, cannabis, in tincture form, was sold legally and openly. You might find Indian hemp as a listed ingredient, promising a gentle descent into slumber. While it offered a different kind of psychoactive effect than opium, it certainly played its part in the era's self-medication landscape. But cannabis was far from the most concerning ingredient. The true heavy hitter, which we'll explore in more detail soon, was opium, often in the form of laudanum. Other popular ingredients included chloral hydrate, bromides, and even sometimes belladonna, which is highly toxic. The manufacturers weren't required to list their ingredients, or if they did, the labels were often vague and misleading. You were essentially buying a mystery liquid, trusting the persuasive power of the advertisement more than any scientific evidence. It's a matter of debate if the widespread use of these unregulated medicines contributed to a general decline in public health or simply masked underlying issues that went untreated. You can easily imagine the frustration of a doctor trying to treat a patient who was self-medicating with a cocktail of unknown, and potentially harmful, substances. The genius of these patent medicine purveyors was their understanding of human psychology. They weren't selling just a cure, they were selling hope. They catered to the working classes who couldn't afford expensive doctor's visits, and to the middle and upper classes who sought discretion for their ailments. The bottle of Dr. So-and-so soothing syrup sat on the bedside table, a silent promise of relief from the relentless anxieties of Victorian life. And for many, the simple act of taking something, anything, might have offered a placebo effect, if nothing else. But for countless others, these potent concoctions led to dependence, exacerbated health problems, and masked the true underlying causes of their sleeplessness. You can almost hear the sighs of weary individuals, reaching for that familiar bottle in the dead of night, hoping that this time, it would finally bring the peace they so desperately craved. As you delve deeper into the shadowy world of Victorian insomnia cures, you inevitably stumble upon the reigning champion of sleep-inducing substances, opiates. Specifically, laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was as common in a Victorian household as tea and sugar. It wasn't hidden away in back alleys, it was openly available, cheap, and widely advertised as a panacea for almost every ailment, with sleeplessness being high on that list. Imagine a scene from A Penny Dreadful, or perhaps a more sedate family drama. You might see a weary mother, exhausted from caring for a large family, pouring a few drops of laudanum into her evening tea. Or a factory worker, his body aching from 12 hours of labor, taking a spoonful to numb the pain and hopefully, finally, drift off. Laudanum was the go-to, over-the-counter remedy for pain, coughs, diarrhea, and, crucially, for the tormented insomniac. Its widespread use makes it a mainstream historical fact, illustrating a fascinating and often disturbing aspect of Victorian self-medication. The appeal of laudanum was undeniable. It was effective, at least in the short term, at dulling the senses and ushering in a hazy, often dreamless, sleep. For people suffering from chronic pain, anxiety, or the sheer exhaustion of their demanding lives, it offered an immediate, albeit temporary, escape. You could buy it at the chemist, the grocer, and even from traveling hawkers. The lack of regulation meant that dosage was often left to the individual, leading to widely varying effects and, predictably, widespread dependence. This casual approach to a powerful narcotic is genuinely shocking by modern standards. You might wonder how a society so concerned with morality and proper conduct could be so blazonly open about opium use. Part of the answer lies in ignorance. The Victorians simply didn't understand addiction in the way we do today. They recognized physical dependence, often attributing it to a weakness of will rather than a physiological condition. And laudanum, being a liquid and often mixed, didn't carry the same stigma as smoking crude opium, which was associated with Chinese immigrants and considered a vice. It's a matter of debate if the sheer prevalence of laudanum created a baseline level of mild opiate dependence across certain segments of society, subtly influencing daily life in ways we can only speculate about. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit about laudanum use for sleep was its application to children. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a particularly infamous patent medicine, contained significant amounts of morphine, derived from opium, and alcohol. It was marketed specifically to quiet fussy babies and ensure they slept through the night. Imagine a parent, desperate for rest, administering a powerful opiate to their infant. While unthinkable now, in the Victorian era, it was a widely accepted, almost mundane practice, leading to countless instances of accidental overdose and chronic dependence in infants. You can almost hear the heartbreaking quiet of a nursery where the children were too drugged to cry. The long-term effects, of course, were devastating. As tolerance built, users required increasingly larger doses, leading to a vicious cycle of dependence. Withdrawal symptoms, when people tried to stop, were agonizing, reinforcing the need for more laudanum. Opium addiction became a quiet epidemic, often masked as other illnesses or simply ignored. Many celebrated writers and artists of the era, from Elizabeth Barrett Browning to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, were known laudanum users, sometimes for pain relief, but often for sleep or to fuel their creative endeavors. Their struggles offer a poignant glimpse into the pervasive nature of this drug. You might feel a chill realizing how easily one could slip into dependence in that era, simply by seeking a good night's rest. The allure of oblivion, the promise of silence in a perpetually busy mind, was too strong for many to resist. Laudanum's reign as the king of sleep aids in Victorian England underscores a profound desperation, a society literally drugged into slumber by the very forces of progress that kept it awake. Its legacy, though often overlooked, subtly shaped the lives and health of millions, whispering them into a chemically induced peace. Having explored the pervasive, and often dangerous, comfort of opiates, you might think the Victorians would have learned their lesson. But the relentless quest for slumber, coupled with burgeoning chemical knowledge, led them down yet another path, one paved with powerful sedatives that promised a more modern approach to sleep, specifically, chloral hydrate. As the 19th century wore on, and scientific understanding, however rudimentary, began to challenge the ancient humours, chemists started to synthesize new compounds. Chloral hydrate, first synthesized in the mid-1830s, gained significant medical attention by the 1860s. It was heralded as a breakthrough, a non-opiate hypnotic that could induce sleep without the perceived downsides of opium. You'd hear it discussed in medical journals, presented as a cleaner, more scientific alternative. A mainstream historical fact is that chloral hydrate quickly became a widely prescribed and popular sedative, earning the nickname knockout drops or bottle of sleep. It was often administered in a solution, tasting rather acrid, but its effectiveness was undeniable. For many desperate insomniacs, it offered a rapid descent into unconsciousness, a welcome reprieve from the torment of wakefulness. Physicians, weary of managing opiate addiction, were eager for a new tool in their arsenal. You might imagine a doctor, feeling quite modern and progressive, confidently writing out a prescription for this new chemical marvel. The initial enthusiasm, however, soon gave way to a darker reality. While not an opiate, chloral hydrate had its own formidable dangers. Dependence was common, and the side effects could be severe. Prolonged use could lead to rashes, digestive issues, and, most alarmingly, heart problems. Overdoses were frequent, as the line between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was perilously thin. Imagine the tragic irony, seeking rest, only to risk your heart or fall into a deeper, permanent sleep. It's a matter of debate whether the medical community truly understood the addictive potential and physiological impact of these synthetic drugs, or if their novelty simply blinded them to the warning signs that, in hindsight, seem so clear. You might wonder how many patients simply traded one form of dependence for another, perhaps even more insidious one. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit about chloral hydrate is its association with Mickey Fins, a slang term for a drink drugged with a knockout substance. While the term's origin is debated, chloral hydrate was certainly used to incapacitate individuals, particularly in unsavory establishments. This darker application underscores the drug's potent, almost immediate, sedative effect. You can almost picture the hushed conversations, the furtive glances, as this powerful chemical slipped from the realm of medicine into the shadows of deception. The popularity of chloral hydrate also highlighted a growing trend, the desire for more targeted, less messy chemical solutions to health problems. It was part of a broader shift in medicine towards pharmaceuticals, even if the understanding of how these chemicals worked on the body was still rudimentary. You were seeing the first steps towards modern pharmacology, but without the safety nets of clinical trials or rigorous regulatory bodies. Patients were, in essence, part of a vast, uncontrolled experiment. So, while chloral hydrate offered a temporary solution to the Victorian insomniac, it came at a significant cost. The promise of a peaceful night's sleep was often delivered, but the waking hours could be plagued by new ailments, and the risk of accidental harm loomed large. This powerful sedative stands as a stark reminder of the era's desperate search for remedies, and the often unforeseen consequences of playing with potent chemicals when understanding was still in its infancy. You might find yourself grateful for the regulations and scientific advancements that now govern our own sleep aids, however imperfect they may still be. Beyond the realm of ingestible concoctions, the Victorian era, with its fervent belief in the power of progress and innovation, also embraced more sparky solutions to nervous ailments. As you continue our journey into the peculiar, you encounter the fascinating, if often nonsensical, world of electrical cures. In an age when electricity was a new, mysterious force, its potential for healing seemed limitless, even if the understanding of how it actually worked on the human body was largely absent. Imagine walking into a medical galvanist's office. You might see an array of imposing, brass-bound machines with wires and terminals, humming faintly. The air might even carry the faint scent of ozone. These devices, often looking more like scientific curiosities than medical instruments, promise to rebalance the body's vital energies, stimulate flagging nerves, and, of course, coax a restless mind into slumber. It was a mainstream historical fact that electrotherapy, in various forms, was a widely adopted treatment for a broad spectrum of conditions, from paralysis to, most pertinently, nervous debility and insomnia. The very novelty of electricity made it seem potent and modern, a stark contrast to older, more traditional remedies. The theory, loosely, was that nervous conditions, including insomnia, were caused by an imbalance or depletion of nerve force or animal electricity. By applying external electrical currents, practitioners believed they could replenish this force, invigorate the nervous system, and restore proper function, including the ability to sleep. You might find yourself being told to hold electrodes connected to a galvanic battery, feeling a tingling sensation as a low-level current passed through your limbs, or perhaps even directly to your head. The experience might have been mildly uncomfortable, but the promise of a cure for your sleepless nights was a powerful motivator. It's a matter of debate if any genuine therapeutic effect came from these electrical treatments, beyond a strong placebo response. Modern understanding of neurological function would suggest that simply zapping the body with a direct current, especially without precise targeting, would do little to address the complex mechanisms of sleep. However, the psychological impact of undergoing such a seemingly scientific and futuristic treatment cannot be underestimated. You were participating in cutting-edge medicine, or at least, what was perceived as such. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the popularity of electrical belts and capsules sold directly to the public. These were consumer-grade devices, often containing small batteries and copper plates, designed to be worn against the skin or even ingested, promising a constant, gentle flow of invigorating electricity. Imagine going to bed wearing an electrically charged cap, hoping its subtle current would lull you into dreams. These products, advertised in an equally flamboyant manner as patent medicines, capitalized on the public's fascination with electricity and their desperate desire for self-administered cures. You could buy an electropathic belt that claimed to cure everything from rheumatism to, yes, insomnia, simply by wearing it around your waist. The sheer audacity of these claims, coupled with the lack of any real scientific backing, makes them a peculiar footnote in the history of medicine. These electrical treatments, while largely ineffective for true physiological sleep disorders, highlight the Victorian era's optimistic, almost blind, faith in technology as a universal problem solver. They believed that if something was new and scientific, it must be better. You can almost sense the palpable hope in the patient's eyes, clutching their electrodes, willing the mysterious electrical force to switch off their restless mind and grant them the sweet release of slumber. It was a testament to the sheer desperation that drove people to try anything, even if it meant subjecting themselves to a mild, continuous electric shock in the name of a good night's sleep. Having perhaps felt a peculiar tingling from the imagined electrical cures, you now find yourself guided towards a more elemental, yet equally peculiar, approach to conquering sleeplessness: hydrotherapy. This wasn't some newfangled electrical marvel. Instead, it was a return to ancient beliefs in the curative power of water, reimagined and embraced with a peculiar Victorian fervor. Imagine a grand hydropathic establishment, perhaps nestled in a picturesque rural setting, far from the clamour of London. These water cures, or spas, became incredibly popular retreats for the ailing, particularly those suffering from nervous conditions like insomnia. You would check in for weeks, sometimes months, undergoing a rigorous regimen of dousings, packs, and baths, all centered around the simple, yet supposedly potent, power of H2O. It's a mainstream historical fact that hydrotherapy, championed by figures like Vincent Priesnitz and later popularized in Britain by Dr. James Gully, gained significant traction in the mid-19th century as a natural, drug-free alternative to the more dubious chemical concoctions. The theory behind hydrotherapy for insomnia was multifaceted. Cold water, it was argued, invigorated the nervous system, stimulating circulation and flushing out toxins believed to cause nervous debility. Warm water, conversely, was thought to be soothing and relaxing, preparing the body for rest. You might find yourself being subjected to a cold sheet pack, where you were wrapped tightly in cold, wet sheets and then covered with blankets, inducing a period of intense shivering followed by a warming sensation, supposedly resetting your internal equilibrium. Or perhaps a sitz bath, where you sat in cold water up to your waist, believed to draw blood away from an overactive brain. The experience was often unpleasant, even shocking, initially. You were essentially undergoing a controlled form of thermal shock therapy. Yet, many swore by its efficacy. The strict regimen, the change of scenery, the removal from the stresses of daily life, and the sheer belief in the treatment undoubtedly contributed to any perceived improvements. It's a matter of debate if the benefits observed were due to the physiological effects of the water itself, or simply the holistic impact of rest, routine, and a strong placebo effect. You might ponder whether the enforced discipline of the Hydropathic Institute, with its early nights and sober diet, was a more powerful sedative than any specific water treatment. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the concept of the dripping sheet, a popular hydrotherapy technique where a sheet, soaked in cold water, was quickly wrung out and then thrown over the patient, who then vigorously rubbed themselves with it. This was believed to stimulate the skin and nerves, promoting healthy circulation and, by extension, better sleep. Imagine the rather comical, yet earnest, scene of a Victorian gentleman or lady briskly rubbing themselves down with a cold, wet sheet in the pursuit of slumber. The sheer physical exertion involved might have been enough to tire one out. Beyond the specific treatments, the very atmosphere of these hydropathic establishments played a role. They often encouraged quiet reflection, early bedtimes, and a temporary detachment from the anxieties of the industrial world. You were stepping into a curated environment designed for rest and recuperation, a stark contrast to the noisy, stimulating urban centers. For some, this break from routine, coupled with the rigorous physical treatments, probably did induce a profound sense of exhaustion conducive to sleep. So, while the idea of wrapping yourself in wet sheets might seem utterly bizarre as a cure for insomnia, for the Victorians, it represented a tangible, often expensive, commitment to wellness. It was a testament to their belief in systematic treatment, even if the system itself was based on theories that would later be largely debunked. You can almost feel the chill of the water, followed by the faint warmth of hope, as they desperately sought respite from their peculiar case of sleeplessness. As you slowly dry off from your imagined hydrotherapy session, your attention might naturally turn to the one thing that connects all humans, regardless of era: food. For the Victorians, particularly when battling the elusive beast of insomnia, diet and digestion were seen as absolutely crucial. The belief was that what you put into your body directly impacted your nervous system and, consequently, your ability to sleep. Imagine perusing a Victorian health manual or a popular ladies' journal. You'd likely find entire chapters dedicated to the proper regulation of one's bowels and the grave dangers of indigestion. It was a mainstream historical fact that digestive health was considered paramount to overall well-being. Any disruption in this delicate internal balance, a bilious attack, an overloaded stomach, or simply flatulence, was often blamed for a restless night. The Victorian obsession with bowel regularity was almost legendary, leading to a booming market in laxatives and digestive aids. You might even find yourself being advised to inspect your stools for clues about your inner health, a somewhat peculiar but earnest practice. The rationale was simple: a troubled gut led to a troubled mind. If your digestion was sluggish, toxins, or whatever they vaguely defined as such, would build up, irritating the nerves and preventing relaxation. Therefore, the cure for sleeplessness often started with a strict dietary regimen. You would be advised to avoid rich, heavy foods, especially in the evening. Spicy dishes, excessive meat, and anything difficult to digest were considered absolute no-nos before bed. Instead, bland foods, light broths, and easily digestible cereals were recommended. You might even be prescribed a specific type of biscuit or a glass of warm milk as a pre-sleep ritual. It's a matter of debate if this intense focus on diet and digestion had a significant impact on insomnia, beyond encouraging healthier eating habits in general. While we now understand the gut-brain axis, the Victorian understanding was more based on observation and anecdotal evidence than on scientific mechanisms. You might question whether a severely restrictive diet simply added another layer of anxiety for the already stressed insomniac. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit in this realm was the belief in the therapeutic properties of gruel for inducing sleep. Gruel, a thin porridge made from oats or other grains boiled in water or milk, was not just a Dickensian staple for the poor, it was also prescribed by doctors as a light, easily digestible supper for those with troubled sleep. Imagine yourself reluctantly spooning down a bowl of lukewarm, watery gruel, hoping its blandness would somehow soothe your overactive mind into submission. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about purity and ease of digestion, making it the perfect sleep food in their eyes. Beyond the specific foods, the very act of eating was considered important. Rapid eating, overeating, or eating at irregular hours were all seen as detrimental to digestive health and, by extension, sleep. You were expected to eat moderately, slowly, and at regular intervals, treating meals as a structured, almost medicinal, part of your day. This meticulous approach to diet speaks volumes about the Victorian desire for control over their bodies and their environment, even in the face of widespread social upheaval. You can almost feel the weight of these dietary expectations, adding another layer of complexity to the simple act of preparing for bed. So, while the Victorian focus on diet for sleep might seem overly simplistic or even quaint to us today, it highlights a persistent human belief that what we consume fundamentally shapes our well-being. For the insomniac of the age, regulating their stomach was seen as a primary, non-medicinal step towards reclaiming their precious hours of rest. As you rise from your imaginary gruel-filled supper, the Victorian physician might, with a knowing nod, steer you towards another common prescription for sleeplessness: exercise and fresh air. This wasn't merely about physical fitness, it was deeply intertwined with the era's beliefs about moral health, nervous energy, and the perceived dangers of sedentary, indoor life. Imagine yourself being encouraged to take a brisk walk in Hyde Park, or perhaps a vigorous ride on a penny-farthing bicycle. The reasoning was straightforward: physical exertion, particularly outdoors, was believed to tire the body, thus making the mind more amenable to rest. Furthermore, the pure air of the countryside or even a well-maintained urban park was thought to have restorative qualities for the lungs and, by extension, the entire nervous system. It's a mainstream historical fact that outdoor activity, from gentle promenades to more strenuous sports, was widely advocated for both physical and mental well-being, often specifically for those suffering from nervous complaints and insomnia. You might hear doctors lamenting the softness of modern life, contrasting it with the robust health of their ancestors who spent more time engaged in manual labor. The connection between physical activity and sleep is, of course, something we understand well today. A tired body often leads to a sleepy mind. However, the Victorian application of this principle had its own peculiar twists. It wasn't just about simple exertion, it was also about escaping the perceived stifling atmosphere of crowded urban homes and offices. The fresh air was seen as a vital tonic, cleansing the lungs and invigorating the blood, which in turn would calm the agitated nerves. You were, in essence, being encouraged to literally air out your anxieties. It's a matter of debate if the specific type or intensity of exercise truly mattered, or if the benefit simply came from the removal of the individual from their stressful environment and the imposition of a healthy routine. You might wonder how effective a gentle stroll really was for someone suffering from chronic, severe insomnia, or if the mental shift of doing something healthy was more impactful than the physical act itself. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit connected to this was the concept of the walking cure, or pedestrianism as a prescribed remedy. For particularly severe cases of nervous exhaustion or insomnia, some doctors would recommend extensive, often solitary, walks in the countryside, sometimes for days or even weeks on end. Imagine being told to simply walk it off, to tramp miles across rolling hills, with the belief that the physical exertion and mental solitude would somehow rebalance your mind and bring forth sleep. This wasn't about competitive sport, it was about a restorative pilgrimage on foot, stripping away the complexities of urban life to find a primal rhythm that would lead to rest. You can almost feel the blisters forming, yet also the strange sense of liberation in this simple, arduous cure. Beyond individual prescriptions, parks and public gardens became increasingly important features of Victorian cities, not just for leisure but also for their perceived health benefits. These green spaces were seen as vital lungs for the sprawling urban centres, offering respite from the pollution and congestion. For the insomniac, a regular visit to such a place was considered a key part of their therapeutic regimen. You were, in a way, being prescribed nature itself. So, while the concept of exercise and fresh air for sleep might seem perfectly sensible to us, the Victorian application reveals a deeper cultural anxiety about the impact of industrialization on the human constitution. It was a plea for a return to simpler, more natural rhythms, a belief that the very act of moving one's body under the open sky could, quite literally, walk away the worries that kept them awake. Having exhausted your imaginary Victorian body with invigorating walks and fresh air, you now stumble upon a particularly pervasive, and perhaps unsettling, Victorian belief concerning sleeplessness, its deep connection to morality. In this era, ailments of the body were frequently linked to ailments of the soul, and a restless night could often be interpreted as a sign of inner turmoil, moral failing, or improper living. Imagine a concerned Victorian relative or even a doctor suggesting that your inability to sleep might stem from a lack of self-control, too much indulgence, or even secret vices. It's a mainstream historical fact that Victorian society placed immense emphasis on self-discipline, restraint, and adherence to strict moral codes. Any deviation from these ideals, whether real or perceived, could be quickly attributed as the root cause of physical or mental distress. Insomnia, therefore, wasn't just a physiological problem, it was often viewed through a highly judgmental lens as a symptom of a weak will or an impure mind. You were not merely suffering from sleeplessness, you were, in a subtle yet profound way, being punished for something. The logic, however twisted it seems to us now, went something like this: a virtuous person, living a life of moderation and purpose, would naturally enjoy sound sleep. Conversely, someone who indulged in excessive pleasures, entertained unwholesome thoughts, or failed to maintain proper domestic order, would inevitably suffer the consequences, including a tormented night. This perspective placed an enormous burden on the individual. If you couldn't sleep, it wasn't just bad luck or a medical condition, it was, in part, your fault. It's a matter of debate if this moralistic framing exacerbated the problem of insomnia by adding a layer of guilt and shame, making it even harder for individuals to relax and find peace. You might feel a profound sense of unfairness, realizing how much internal pressure the Victorians already faced, without adding moral condemnation to their inability to sleep. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit illustrating this moralistic connection is the specific condemnation of excessive novel reading, especially by women, as a cause of nervous complaints and sleeplessness. Novels, particularly romantic ones, were seen by some as stimulating the imagination too much, leading to brain fag and a restless mind, particularly if indulged in after dark. The concern wasn't just about eye strain, it was about the supposed moral danger of fanciful narratives distracting from domestic duties and proper, serious thought. Imagine being denied the comfort of a good book before bed, not for medical reasons, but for fear of moral decay and subsequent wakefulness. This moral lens extended to various aspects of daily life. Overworking, while often unavoidable for many, could also be seen as a form of excess, leading to exhaustion and sleeplessness. Yet, paradoxically, idleness was also condemned. The ideal Victorian was busy but balanced, productive but not excessive. Finding that narrow path, especially in a rapidly changing world, was a constant challenge, and any misstep could lead to the dreaded sleepless night, a visible manifestation of one's perceived moral imbalance. So, when a Victorian insomniac sought help, they might not just receive a medical prescription, but also a stern lecture on their habits, their leisure pursuits, or even their inner thoughts. The peculiar case of Victorian insomnia was as much a moral quandary as it was a medical one, revealing a society deeply invested in the idea that a good night's sleep was not just a biological necessity, but a righteous reward for a life well lived. Stepping away from the moral judgments of the era, you next encounter another significant factor in Victorian insomnia prescriptions: gendered remedies. It was a pervasive, mainstream historical fact that medical advice, and particularly the recommended cures for nervous complaints like sleeplessness, often differed starkly depending on whether the patient was a man or a woman. the prevailing medical and social theories of the day painted men and women as fundamentally different beings, with distinct physiological and psychological constitutions, leading to divergent approaches to their ailments. Imagine a Victorian physician treating a man versus a woman for the same complaint of insomnia. For a man, the sleeplessness might be attributed to overwork, financial stress, or perhaps too much intellectual exertion. The prescribed remedies might focus on vigorous exercise, a tonic to restore his masculine vigor, or a period of rest away from the demands of his profession. The emphasis was often on strengthening his constitution, preparing him to return to his role as a productive member of society. You might hear the doctor advising a gentleman to take up hunting or some other robust outdoor pursuit to clear his head and tire his body. For a woman, however, the diagnosis and treatment for insomnia took a decidedly different turn. Her sleeplessness was frequently blamed on her delicate nervous system, her reproductive organs, or even the emotional stresses of domestic life. The term hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis often applied to women exhibiting a wide range of symptoms, including insomnia, anxiety, and depression. It was rooted in ancient Greek beliefs about a wandering womb causing female ailments. Consequently, remedies for women often focused on calming the nerves, ensuring domestic tranquility, or, in more extreme cases, therapies directly related to their reproductive health. It's a matter of debate how much of this gendered medical approach was based on genuine physiological differences and how much was simply a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal social norms. You might feel a pang of frustration at the pervasive limitations placed upon women's health by these outdated theories. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit illustrating this gendered approach is the surprisingly common prescription of a rest cure specifically for women. Championed by American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, this cure involved strict bed rest, isolation from family and friends, overfeeding, often including copious amounts of milk, and massage. While seemingly gentle, it was incredibly restrictive and disempowering, particularly for women who felt suffocated by domestic life. The idea was to completely remove the woman from any stimulating environment, allowing her overwrought nerves to recuperate. Imagine being confined to your bed for weeks, forbidden from reading, writing, or even engaging in conversation, all in the name of curing your sleeplessness. This cure was infamously applied to the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who vividly described its suffocating effects in her short story The Yellow Wallpaper. The different approaches to male and female insomnia highlight the Victorian era's rigid gender roles. Men were seen as the active, rational providers, susceptible to the stresses of the public sphere. Women were perceived as passive, emotional, and primarily suited for the domestic sphere, with their bodies and minds intricately linked to their reproductive functions. When they couldn't sleep, the medical community often sought answers within these prescribed gendered frameworks, offering solutions that reinforced rather than challenged societal expectations. You see how deeply ingrained these biases were, even in the supposedly scientific realm of medicine. So, while the goal was always to induce sleep, the path taken varied significantly based on the patient's gender. The peculiar case of Victorian insomnia cures, therefore, not only reflects their medical understanding but also shines a light on the complex social fabric and gender dynamics that shaped everyday life, even in the quiet of the bedroom. Having explored the gendered nuances of Victorian insomnia treatments, you now shift your focus to the very environment in which sleep was supposed to occur, the Victorian bedroom. You might imagine opulent, heavy furnishings, but for many, the reality of sleepwear and bedding, along with the overall sleeping environment, contributed significantly to their nocturnal struggles. Imagine preparing for bed in a typical Victorian home. Your sleepwear, far from the light, breathable fabrics we often prefer today, might consist of heavy flannel nightgowns or nightshirts, designed more for warmth in poorly heated rooms than for comfort. While some embraced lighter materials for summer, the emphasis was often on practicality and modesty. It's a mainstream historical fact that layering was common, even in bed, due to inconsistent heating. You might find yourself swaddled in thick garments, perhaps even a nightcap to keep your head warm, potentially leading to overheating, a known disruptor of sleep. The bed itself presented its own set of challenges. Mattresses were commonly stuffed with materials like straw, horsehair, or even feathers. While feathers offered some softness, straw and horsehair could be lumpy, hard, and prone to harboring dust mites and other unpleasantries. A truly comfortable, supportive mattress as we know it simply didn't exist. You might feel the unevenness beneath you, the stiff edges, or the tendency for these natural fillings to compress and become unyielding over time. It's a matter of debate if the widespread use of such unforgiving bedding contributed to chronic discomfort and exacerbated existing sleep problems, or if the Victorians simply had a higher tolerance for less than ideal sleeping arrangements. You might wonder how many restless nights were caused not by a nervous constitution, but by a simple case of an uncomfortable bed. Beyond the mattress, the bed frame itself was often a heavy, elaborate affair, sometimes with tall posts and heavy curtains. While these curtains provided privacy and a sense of enclosure, they also restricted air circulation, potentially leading to stuffiness and poor ventilation in the sleeping area. You might feel a distinct lack of fresh air, particularly if your windows were kept tightly shut to ward off the cold or the perceived dangers of night air. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit relates to the practice of warming pans and hot bricks placed in beds to pre-warm the sheets during colder months. While seemingly cozy, these could sometimes become too hot, causing discomfort or even mild burns, thus disrupting the very sleep they were meant to encourage. Imagine tucking your feet around a hot, heavy brick, hoping for warmth, only to have it radiate an uncomfortable heat that keeps you awake. It speaks to the lengths they went to mitigate cold, often at the expense of true comfort. The Victorian bedroom, despite its often ornate appearance, was frequently a battleground for sleep. Factors like ambient temperature, mattress comfort, and even the simple weight of one's nightclothes all played a subtle yet significant role in whether a person could drift off peacefully. You were not just contending with your racing mind, but also with the physical realities of a less-than-ideal sleep environment, a silent conspirator in the peculiar case of Victorian sleeplessness. Having explored the sometimes uncomfortable realities of Victorian sleepwear and bedding, you now find yourself confronted by perhaps the most unrelenting adversary of slumber in the bustling metropolis: household noises and the cacophony of urban life. The very sounds of a rapidly industrializing city often conspired against a peaceful night's rest, creating an environment that was anything but conducive to quiet contemplation or drifting off. Imagine lying in your bed, perhaps on a street in central London. It's a mainstream historical fact that Victorian cities, particularly London, were incredibly noisy places, far more so than their pre-industrial counterparts. The silence of the countryside was a distant memory. You'd be assailed by a constant barrage of sounds: the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses on cobblestones, the rhythmic clopping of hooves, the distant shriek of train whistles, and the incessant cries of street vendors who seemed to operate at all hours. Even the advent of gaslight, while banishing literal darkness, removed the incentive for early bedtimes, extending the waking hours of the city and thus the period of noise. You might feel a dull ache in your ears, a constant background hum that never truly faded. Beyond the street, the Victorian house itself could be a source of disturbance. Houses were often crowded, with multiple generations living under one roof, or servants moving about at all hours. Thin walls meant that conversations, footsteps, and the sounds of daily life from within the household could easily penetrate the sanctity of the bedroom. And for those in lower-income areas, the proximity of factories, workshops, or even noisy public houses meant an almost inescapable sonic assault. It's a matter of debate if the Victorians simply developed a higher tolerance for noise, or if the constant din subtly contributed to their widespread nervous complaints and inability to relax. You might wonder how anyone truly achieved deep, restorative sleep amidst such a ceaseless auditory assault. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit illustrating this struggle with noise is the advent of night watchmen, or rattlers who, in earlier periods, would patrol the streets and use a wooden rattle to signify their presence and perhaps warn off criminals. While their primary purpose wasn't to aid sleep, their very existence underscores a time when urban peace was elusive. As the Victorian era progressed, and the professional police force took over, the general din merely intensified with industrialization. Imagine the paradox: hoping for quiet, but the very measures of safety contributed to the noise. For the sensitive insomniac, every distant bell, every creaking floorboard, every rumble of a passing cart became an unwelcome companion in the long hours of the night. So, while Victorian doctors prescribed potions and practices, the very environment of the era often worked against their efforts. The noise of progress, the constant hum of a city that never truly slept, became an invisible, yet powerful, antagonist in the peculiar case of Victorian insomnia. You can almost feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a constant reminder that true peace was a luxury few could afford. Having weathered the incessant urban clamor, you now approach a darker, more somber aspect of Victorian society's response to persistent sleeplessness, the rise of asylums. When all the tonics, the hydrotherapy, the electrical cures, and the moral admonishments failed, and an individual's nervous debility deepened into what was considered outright madness, the only remaining solution was often institutionalization. Imagine the chilling grandeur of a vast Victorian asylum, perhaps a formidable brick edifice with high walls, standing starkly against the skyline on the outskirts of a town. These institutions, often initially conceived with noble intentions for humane treatment, became, for many, the final destination when their minds, and their sleep, completely abandoned them. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Victorian era saw a significant increase in the number and size of lunatic asylums, reflecting a growing societal awareness of mental illness, but also a desire to contain and manage those deemed unfit for mainstream society. You might hear whispers of friends or family members put away due to their uncontrollable anxieties or persistent hallucinations, with sleeplessness often being a significant preceding symptom. The connection to insomnia was profound. Severe, chronic sleeplessness was often seen not just as a symptom of a nervous disorder, but as a direct pathway to insanity. The logic was that a mind deprived of restorative rest would eventually break down. Thus, a patient whose insomnia proved resistant to all other remedies might eventually be committed, not just for their lack of sleep, but for the broader nervous exhaustion or mental alienation that sleeplessness was believed to cause or exacerbate. The asylum, therefore, became a place where the most severe cases of insomnia, often intertwined with other psychological distress, were managed. You can almost feel the cold dread of realizing that your inability to find peace at night could lead you to such a grim fate. Treatment within these asylums for insomnia often continued the trend seen outside, but with greater intensity and fewer ethical restraints. Patients might be subjected to prolonged rest cures, often involving forced isolation and heavy sedation with compounds like chloral hydrate or bromides, sometimes in truly staggering doses. The goal was to enforce a state of calm, or at least quiescence, regardless of the patient's desire or long-term well-being. It's a matter of debate if the isolation and heavy sedation provided any true therapeutic benefit for sleep, or if they simply pacified patients, making them easier to manage within the institutional setting. You might grimace at the thought of a life spent in a perpetual drugged haze, all in the name of rest. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit about asylum life and sleep was the occasional use of hydrotherapy in its more extreme forms within these institutions, sometimes involving continuous baths for days or even weeks. Patients, sometimes agitated or unable to sleep, would be immersed in warm water for extended periods, theoretically to soothe their nerves and induce calm. While a seemingly gentle method, its prolonged application in an institutional setting could be deeply disorienting and dehumanizing. Imagine floating in a tub for days, the world a hazy blur, as medical staff sought to force your troubled mind into submission through the constant embrace of water. The asylum represents the ultimate, and often most tragic, answer to the peculiar case of Victorian insomnia. It was the final frontier when personal struggle became a public problem, and when a troubled mind was deemed too disruptive for conventional society. You understand that for many, these institutions were places of last resort, where the desperate search for sleep ended not in peaceful slumber, but in a life confined, a chilling testament to the era's limitations in truly understanding and treating mental distress. After peering into the somber world of Victorian asylums, you might find yourself wondering about the individuals who actually suffered through these peculiar cures. It's comforting to know that even among the well-known figures of the era, the struggle with sleeplessness was a deeply personal, often public, battle. This section offers brief glimpses into the insomnia struggles of notable Victorians, reminding you that this affliction spared no one, regardless of their societal standing. Imagine the grand, brooding presence of Charles Dickens. A mainstream historical fact about Dickens is his intense energy and relentless work ethic, but beneath this industrious exterior, he frequently battled insomnia. His nights were often spent walking the streets of London, sometimes for miles, an attempt to tire himself out and find the elusive peace that eluded him in bed. He described these nocturnal wanderings in his essays, a quirky, lesser-known tidbit being his fascination with the sleeping and waking city, often finding inspiration in the very quiet, or lack thereof, of the early hours. For Dickens, these walks were a self-prescribed hydrotherapy of the urban kind, soaking in the city until exhaustion brought a temporary truce with his racing mind. It's a matter of debate whether his creative genius was fueled by his restless nights, or if his sleeplessness was a cruel byproduct of his demanding artistic spirit. You might picture him, cape flapping in the wind, a solitary figure navigating the gaslit maze, desperately seeking an end to his wakefulness. Then consider Florence Nightingale, the celebrated nurse and social reformer. Despite her incredible drive and the profound impact she had on healthcare, Nightingale suffered from chronic illness and, consequently, severe insomnia throughout much of her life. Her dedication often meant working through the night, but even when she attempted rest, sleep eluded her. She often relied on opiates, a common solution of the time, to find even a few hours of peace. Her struggle highlights the physical toll of her demanding work and the limitations of Victorian medicine to truly alleviate her suffering. You can almost feel the exhaustion radiating from her, a figure synonymous with care and comfort, yet so personally deprived of it. Another poignant example is Queen Victoria herself. While her public image was one of unwavering stoicism, her private life, especially after the death of Prince Albert, was plagued by bouts of grief-induced insomnia. For a figure who embodied the stability of the era, her personal struggle with sleep offers a glimpse into the universal nature of the affliction, impacting even the most powerful. Her remedies would have been at the disposal of the best physicians, yet even royal privilege couldn't guarantee a peaceful night. You might imagine the whispers in the palace, the concern over the sovereign's rest, as her sleeplessness became a quiet worry for the nation. Even figures like Alfred, Lord Tennyson, the revered poet laureate, wrestled with sleeplessness. His introspective and often melancholy poetry sometimes reflected this inner turmoil. He was known to take long, solitary walks in nature, much like Dickens in the city, seeking solace and physical exhaustion to induce sleep. These intellectual giants, who shaped the Victorian mind, were just as vulnerable to its peculiar torments as anyone else. These personal struggles, often hidden behind polite society's facade, confirm that insomnia was not merely a theoretical problem discussed in medical journals but a very real, very distressing experience for countless individuals across all strata of Victorian society. You realize that beneath the layers of peculiar cures and moral judgments, there was a profound, shared human experience of tossing and turning, longing for the oblivion of sleep. Having glimpsed the personal torments of famous insomniacs, you might now be curious about the professionals who were meant to help them. Let's turn our attention to the Victorian sleep doctor's advice, and you'll find a landscape of sometimes contradictory, sometimes surprisingly sensible, and often uniquely earnest recommendations from the physicians of the era. Imagine sitting across from a Victorian physician, perhaps Dr. William Hammond, a prominent American neurologist, or a respected British general practitioner. They would listen intently to your complaints of wakefulness, perhaps feeling your pulse, checking your tongue, and certainly asking about your digestion. It's a mainstream historical fact that while specialized sleep medicine didn't exist as we know it, doctors treated insomnia as a significant nervous complaint, often relying on their general medical knowledge and the prevailing theories of the day. You would be given a careful diagnosis, often framed in terms of nervous exhaustion, brain fag, or simply want of sleep. Their advice, as you might expect, was a blend of what we've already touched upon. They would advocate for dietary changes, urging you to avoid heavy suppers, rich foods, and alcohol before bed. They would champion fresh air and moderate exercise, suggesting walks or carriage rides to tire the body without overstimulating the mind. They might prescribe warm baths or sponges, reiterating the soothing power of hydrotherapy. For the most part, these were sensible, if not always sufficient, recommendations. You might nod along, recognizing some echoes of modern health advice, albeit couched in much older language. However, the sleep doctor's advice also delved into areas that now seem quaint, or even bizarre. They would often emphasize the importance of a quiet, darkened room, free from drafts but with pure air, a delicate balance to strike in a drafty Victorian house. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the recommendation by some doctors for patients to engage in monotonous mental tasks just before bed. This could include counting sheep, a classic for a reason, reciting lists, or even attempting to solve simple arithmetic problems in their head. The idea was to bore the mind into submission, to gently guide it away from anxious thoughts and towards a dull, repetitive rhythm that might lull it into sleep. Imagine trying to fall asleep by mentally reciting the periodic table, or calculating your tax deductions, a truly peculiar form of self-torture for modern sensibilities. It's a matter of debate how much Victorian doctors genuinely believed in the efficacy of all their recommendations, or if some were offered more out of a lack of better alternatives and a desire to provide some form of treatment. You might consider that without the benefit of sleep labs, neurochemistry, or even a basic understanding of sleep cycles, these physicians were largely navigating in the dark, relying on observation, anecdote, and the prevailing, often speculative, medical theories of their time. The sheer variety of their recommendations, sometimes conflicting, highlights this experimental approach. Beyond the specific treatments, Victorian doctors often played a crucial role in providing reassurance and establishing a routine. For many patients, simply having a respected authority figure acknowledge their suffering and offer a plan, however flawed, could provide significant psychological comfort. You can almost hear the soothing, if slightly paternalistic, tones of a doctor assuring a worried patient that their sleeplessness, while distressing, was manageable with diligent adherence to his prescriptions. The peculiar case of Victorian insomnia was, for these doctors, a complex puzzle requiring a holistic, if sometimes misguided, approach. Moving beyond the formal advice of the medical establishment, you discover that the Victorians, much like people in every era, also relied on older, more traditional remedies, often passed down through generations. This brings us to the quiet, sometimes secret, world of herbal remedies and folk wisdom for sleep, which existed alongside, and sometimes in opposition to, the burgeoning scientific approaches. Imagine a kitchen garden, perhaps in a rural cottage, or even a small patch behind a terraced house in the city. Here, you'd find plants lovingly tended, not just for food, but for their perceived medicinal properties. It's a mainstream historical fact that herbal medicine, deeply rooted in centuries of tradition, remained a significant part of healthcare for many Victorians, especially those who couldn't afford a doctor or who mistrusted newfangled chemical cures. For sleeplessness, this often meant turning to plants known for their calming or sedative qualities. You might be advised to brew a special tea before bed, a ritual steeped in ancient practice. Among the most popular herbal remedies for sleep was valerian. Its distinctive, somewhat pungent, scent was believed to be calming, and tinctures or teas made from its roots were commonly used to alleviate anxiety and induce slumber. Another widespread choice was chamomile, gentle and widely available, often brewed into a soothing bedtime drink. You might also encounter mentions of hops, often used in sleep pillows, or even opium poppies grown discreetly for their powerful sedative properties, bridging the gap between folk medicine and more potent, regulated, or unregulated, narcotics. It's a matter of debate how effective these herbal remedies truly were beyond a mild sedative effect or powerful placebo, especially for severe chronic insomnia. You might wonder if the gentle ritual of preparing and consuming these natural remedies was as important as their chemical constituents. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit involves the use of lavender not just for its pleasant scent, but for its purported ability to bring on sleep when placed near the pillow or sprinkled on the sheets. While we now understand its aromatherapeutic properties, for the Victorians, it was part of a broader, intuitive understanding of nature's calming influences. Imagine stuffing a small sachet with dried lavender and tucking it beside your head, hoping its fragrance would guide you gently into dreams. It speaks to a softer, more sensory approach to inducing rest, contrasting sharply with the harshness of some chemical interventions. Beyond specific herbs, folk wisdom also encompassed a range of non-medicinal practices aimed at promoting sleep. These included simple things like ensuring the room was dark and quiet, counting repetitive patterns, or even superstitious rituals aimed at warding off evil spirits or bad dreams that might disturb rest. You might be told to turn your shoes upside down before bed, or to place a specific object under your pillow for protection. These practices, while often unscientific, offered a sense of control and comfort in the face of an uncontrollable affliction. So, while the Victorian age prided itself on scientific advancement, many still held on to the comforting, familiar wisdom of generations past. The peculiar case of Victorian insomnia was tackled not just with new chemicals and machines, but also with the enduring power of nature and the quiet rituals of folk medicine, a gentle counterpoint to the era's relentless march of progress. Having explored the tangible remedies, both conventional and folk, you now drift into the more ethereal, less scientific attempts Victorians made to control their restless minds, spiritualism and mesmerism. These were not mainstream medical treatments, but rather philosophical and psychological approaches that gained significant popularity, offering alternative paths to mental tranquility and, hopefully, sleep, for those disillusioned with traditional cures. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, perhaps at a séance table, or in the presence of a mesmerist. The air is thick with anticipation, and a peculiar blend of hope and skepticism. It's a mainstream historical fact that spiritualism, the belief in communicating with the dead, experienced a massive boom in the mid to late Victorian era, partly as a response to the scientific materialism of the age, and partly as a coping mechanism for widespread grief. While not directly a cure for insomnia, many adherents sought peace of mind through contact with departed loved ones, believing that a calm spirit would lead to a calm body, and thus, sound sleep. You might attend a séance hoping that a message from the other side might resolve an earthly worry that kept you awake. The connection to sleep was often indirect but powerful. If a person's insomnia was believed to stem from anxiety, guilt, or unresolved grief, then finding solace through spiritualist practices could, theoretically, quiet the mind. The rituals themselves, the darkened rooms, the hushed tones, the focus on something beyond the mundane, could also induce a trance-like state conducive to relaxation. It's a matter of debate whether the perceived benefits were purely psychological, a powerful placebo effect, or if the intense focus involved simply tired the mind enough to allow sleep to take hold. You might feel the collective sigh of relief from a group, genuinely convinced they had found peace, even if it was born of illusion. Alongside spiritualism, mesmerism, often referred to as animal magnetism, offered another alternative. Named after Franz Mesmer, this practice involved a practitioner making passes over a subject's body, theoretically manipulating an invisible magnetic fluid to induce a trance or a state of heightened suggestibility. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that mesmerism was quite popular for its supposed ability to induce a mesmeric sleep, a deep, almost hypnotic slumber that was distinct from natural sleep. For insomniacs, this artificial sleep was incredibly appealing. Imagine a mesmerist waving their hands over you, their gaze steady, as you slowly feel your eyelids grow heavy, succumbing to a strange, induced peace. This wasn't about rest for the body, but about calming the agitated mind through external influence. Mesmerists claim to be able to alleviate various nervous complaints, including insomnia, by rebalancing the patient's internal fluid. While often dismissed as quackery by the scientific establishment, many people swore by its efficacy. The very act of surrendering control to another person, trusting in their power to induce sleep, might have been a powerful psychological release for those accustomed to their own minds betraying them night after night. You might find yourself intrigued by the sheer psychological power at play, regardless of its scientific validity. These esoteric practices highlight the desperation of Victorians seeking solace from their peculiar case of sleeplessness. When conventional medicine offered no relief, and the pressures of modern life seemed overwhelming, people reached for the intangible, the spiritual, or the hypnotically induced, hoping to find a path to the elusive peace of slumber. Having witnessed the more mystical attempts to reclaim sleep, you now arrive at the very beginnings of a more rigorous, scientific understanding of sleep itself. This is where the peculiar case of Victorian insomnia starts to meet the dawn of modern sleep science, a slow, incremental shift from anecdotal observation and speculative theories to empirical investigation. Imagine peering into an early laboratory, perhaps in a German university, where intrepid scientists are beginning to use newly invented tools to measure physiological responses. It's a mainstream historical fact that the late 19th century saw the very first scientific investigations into the nature of sleep, moving beyond simply cataloguing its absence. Pioneers like Ivan Pavlov, though primarily known for his work on conditioning, also conducted rudimentary experiments on sleep in animals, observing brain activity and physiological changes. This marked a profound departure from the earlier focus on humors or nervous energy, attempting to view sleep as a measurable, biological process. You would feel the excitement of discovery, the sense that humanity was finally starting to unravel one of its most enduring mysteries. The initial breakthroughs were small, but significant. Scientists began to recognize patterns of brain waves, although the sophisticated electroencephalography (EEG) technology we have today was still decades away. They started to consider sleep not as a passive state of cessation, but as an active process with distinct stages. This nascent understanding challenged the prevailing notion that insomnia was simply a failure to switch off the mind, hinting instead at underlying physiological mechanisms. It's a matter of debate if these early scientific glimmers immediately impacted the practical treatment of insomnia, or if the medical community was slow to integrate findings that often seemed abstract and far removed from the daily realities of patient care. You might sense the tension between the rigorous, slow pace of scientific discovery and the desperate urgency of a patient simply wanting to sleep. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit from this period is the development of early somnoscopes or devices designed to measure sleep, however crudely. These were often elaborate contraptions involving springs, levers, and recording cylinders that would track movements during sleep. While rudimentary and prone to inaccuracies, they represented the first attempts to quantify and objectively study sleep, rather than relying solely on subjective reports of wakefulness. Imagine hooking yourself up to a contraption of wires and clockwork before bed, hoping its whirring and clicking might reveal the secrets of your troubled nights. This was science in its infancy, clumsy perhaps, but driven by a powerful curiosity. The groundwork laid in the late Victorian era, though seemingly minor at the time, was crucial for future advancements. The shift from philosophical speculation to empirical observation, however limited, began to pave the way for modern sleep medicine, with its understanding of REM and non-REM sleep, sleep disorders, and targeted therapeutic interventions. You recognize that the struggles of the Victorian insomniac, and the sometimes bizarre cures they endured, were, in a way, part of the long, winding road that led us to our current, more informed understanding of this fundamental human need. The very concept of sleep science was born in this era of paradox, where desperate remedies coexisted with the first faint stirrings of true enlightenment. And so, after journeying through the peculiar landscape of Victorian sleeplessness, you arrive at the present, left to ponder the legacy of Victorian sleep and what these curious cures truly tell us about the era. This isn't just a story about ineffective treatments, it's a reflection of a society grappling with rapid change, evolving scientific understanding, and the enduring human struggle for peace of mind. Imagine looking back at the bustling, gaslit streets from a modern perspective. The Victorians, in their earnest attempts to conquer insomnia, bequeathed to us a fascinating record of human ingenuity, desperation, and sometimes, outright folly. It's a mainstream historical fact that many of the patent medicines and early sedatives they employed, while dangerous, laid some of the earliest groundwork for pharmaceutical development, however uncontrolled. You see the faint outlines of modern pharmacology, often born from trial and error, much of it painful. This era's uninhibited experimentation, born of necessity and curiosity, served as a stark lesson in the importance of regulation and scientific rigor in medicine. The peculiar cases of Victorian insomnia cures also highlight a profound societal anxiety. The Industrial Revolution, with its relentless pace, artificial light, and urban congestion, fundamentally altered human rhythms. Sleeplessness became a symptom of a broader societal unease, a sign that progress, while bringing immense benefits, also brought new forms of stress. It's a matter of debate whether the Victorians truly had more insomnia than previous generations, or if their hyper-awareness and documentation of it simply made it seem so. You might reflect on how many of their perceived new problems, like nervous debility from overwork, still resonate deeply in our hyper-connected, always-on world today. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit that encapsulates this legacy is the subtle shift in bedroom design and rituals. While modern beds are far more comfortable and our understanding of sleep vastly superior, the Victorian emphasis on darkness, quiet, and routine, even if achieved with questionable methods, has carried through. We still pull curtains, seek silence, and often engage in winding down rituals, echoing their fundamental, if sometimes misguided, pursuit of optimal conditions for rest. Imagine the threads of their efforts, however peculiar, woven into the very fabric of our contemporary sleep hygiene advice. Ultimately, the story of Victorian insomnia cures is a testament to the enduring human need for sleep and the lengths to which people will go to achieve it. From the widespread embrace of dangerous opiates to the bizarre applications of electricity, and the rigorous, often uncomfortable, regimens of hydrotherapy, each cure tells a story of hope against a pervasive torment. They remind us that medicine is a constantly evolving field, built on layers of past understanding and, often, misunderstanding. You gain a deeper appreciation for the advancements that have been made, while also recognizing the persistent, often cyclical, nature of our anxieties about rest. The Victorians, in their earnest efforts, remind us that the quest for a good night's sleep is a timeless one, a quiet battle fought in the privacy of the bedroom, reflecting the broader anxieties and scientific limitations of any given age. As the gaslights of Victorian London finally begin to dim in your mind's eye, and the distant clatter of carriages softens to a whisper, allow yourself to simply it be. The peculiar remedies, the earnest hopes, the societal anxieties, they all begin to fade now, becoming mere echoes in the gentle quiet of the night. You've journeyed through their desperate search for slumber, and perhaps, in doing so, you've discovered a newfound appreciation for the silent, restorative gift of your own approaching rest. The heavy velvets of their bedrooms, the faint scent of laudanum, the distant rumbles, all dissolve into the soft ambient hum around you. Let your own worries, whatever they may be, begin to settle, like dust motes in the final rays of a setting sun. There's nothing left to do now, nothing to chase, just the gentle descent into peaceful quiet. Feel your breath deepen, your body relax, as the peculiar history of their wakefulness guides you, paradoxically, toward your own profound and tranquil sleep. This video explored the diverse and often peculiar methods Victorians used to combat widespread insomnia, ranging from patent medicines and opiates to hydrotherapy, electrical cures, and various lifestyle adjustments. It highlighted how societal pressures, nascent medical understanding, and moral judgments influence these remedies. The era's desperate search for sleep offers a fascinating glimpse into a society grappling with the impacts of industrialization and the persistent human need for rest.